we had our first discourse, and this is the second discourse, and we want to start out with the reading, the early Christian church, and the reason for that is that when we talk about the Pope now, the others, and the future of the church, then we have to have some kind of a criterion by which we can judge. We cannot judge the popes by modern standards. That would not entirely be fair. And so what we said is the first paradigm of Christianity, the Jewish Christian paradigm, and the Gospels, that is the norm, that is normative, by which we then can make some judgments, which is necessary in order to go forward. But it should not be our own subjective ideas or our own mood or whatever, and also not necessarily norms of modernity. That's true for the Islamic brothers and sisters, it is true for the Jewish brothers and sisters, and so on. Religion cannot be judged simply by modern standards and say you should get more modern or you should be more like us or whatever, because religious people have internal criteria which they have to obey, and that, of course, has to be appreciated. So we had these two stories the last time about the property issue in the early Christian church, and that in some communities at least it was communistic according to the principle from everybody according to his ability to everybody according to his need, which later on Karl Marx took over, and usually we don't remember that this was Christian heritage. So today is another story, and we want to listen to the tone of the story. It's not a very simple story, and I had a good friend, the Eugen Kogon, who was in the concentration camp in Auschwitz, and then he wrote the book, The SS State. And when he in a Protestant meeting, he heard that story, and he was not really pleased about it. But it is in the New Testament, so let's see what we can say about it. So there was another man, however, called Ananias. He and his wife, Sapphira, agreed to sell a property. So we had the last time that people sold their property and gave the money to Peter, and then Peter distributed it. And so here is an example of this. He and his wife, Sapphira, agreed to sell a property. But with his wife's connivance, he kept back part of the proceeds and brought the rest and presented it to the apostles. Ananias, Peter said, how can Satan have so possessed you that you should lie to the Holy Spirit and keep back part of the money from the land? While you still owned the land, wasn't it yours to keep? That is very important now. It's not forced communism, it's voluntary. Wasn't it, you could keep it back? How can Satan have so possessed you that you should lie to the Holy Spirit and keep back part of the money from the land? While you still owned the land, wasn't it yours to keep? And after you had sold it, wasn't the money yours to do with as you liked? What put this scheme into your mind? It is not to men that you have lied, but to God. So the most important thing is private property is not totally denied. That is important. So it was a particular ideal because Jesus had said to the young rich man, he wanted to say, what do I need to have eternal life? And then Jesus said, keep the commandment. And he said, I did. And then he said, you have to do one more thing, to sell everything what you have and give it to the poor. So it is a high ideal. And we can say that probably not all the communities in Jerusalem or Damascus and so on did this. So Ananias was free to keep it, but now he said he would give it, and he didn't give it all. And it is that fraud then which is the problem. When he heard this, Ananias fell down dead. Now, this can very well happen psychologically. particularly when you have a highly charismatic personality like Peter or so. If something like that happens and you feel guilty, it can be psychosomatic, and it can really do something to your circulation. And so that may have happened here. When he heard this, Ananias fell down dead. This made a profound impression on everyone present. The younger man got up, wrapped the body in a sheet, carried it out, and buried it. About 3 hours later, it's even the exact time, about 3 hours later, his wife came in, not knowing what had taken place. Peter challenged her. "Tell me, was this the price you sold the land for?" "Yes," she said. "That was the price." Peter then said, "So you and your husband have agreed to put the Spirit of the Lord to the test. What made you do it? You hear those footsteps? They have just been to bury your husband. They will carry you out too." Instantly she dropped dead at his feet. When the young men came in, they found that she was dead, and they carried her out and buried her by the side of her husband. This made a profound impression on the whole church and on all who heard it. So this is a very uncomfortable type of a story, and that is why Kogan, who had been in Auschwitz and wrote this estate book, was not comfortable with this story. It makes us uncomfortable. But what we should learn from it is that obviously to live a communistic life in order to enter the kingdom of God was a high ideal. But if people didn't want to do this, then they were free. They did not have, it was not forced type of communism. That is very important. And we said then the mainstream church did give it up, this communism, completely, and it moved over to the orders, the monastic orders. So the Benedictines, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and so on, they took this ideal over, but they left the mainstream of the church. And then we have it in heretical groups like the Albigenses, Catholicenses, and so on in France, who then do that too. So Jesus demands that you, in order to have eternal life and to enter the kingdom of God, you have to live communistically. And here we are in the church of Thomas More. Thomas More wrote the Utopia, in which he also mentions that again, that the precondition of entering the kingdom of God and have eternal life is this communistic life, to give up all the poverty. And we have to ask, and we did that the last time already when we discussed St. Francis and so on, what is wrong with, with poverty? We have it also among Greek philosophers who rejected private property. At that time, private property was about 10,000 years old. It came with farming and with villages and land property, but it became then also in civil society, in the city-states, in Sodom and Gomorrah, and so on. It produced division among people. Some had private properties, others didn't, and then you have the class antagonism and you have the class struggle, and then you have the wars between city-states and nations for property, like what did we have said, like rubber from Vietnam or coffee from El Salvador. We had a movie about it today, or oil from Iraq, where now 2/3 of the oil wells belong to us and 1/3 belongs to the Iraqi people, and so on. So or even when you go to the Lake Michigan and you, at least a few years ago, suddenly you had to stop. You couldn't walk along the beach anymore because that was private property and so on. So private property excludes others. It says this is mine and this is yours, and this division then, this dualism appears. And that was always seen by prophets and by philosophers and so on as something negative, as a source of alienating people from each other. So, but for us specifically today, and we said the last time, when we want to discuss here, we want to be honest, right? And we want to break through the ideological appearance, which is necessary for the stability of society. But in the university and the church, is devoted to the truth, and therefore we have to break through this. So we can talk, when we talk about contemporary issues, what has happened in recent days where the whole government broke down because of the so-called Obamacare or the Affordable Health Act, where what other nations have done for maybe a century or more, we have such hard time for it because it was the usual thing in this country that the health care, if there was any, was connected with the job. So the ruling class in this country, and that means liberalism, is a little bit confusing. We have two liberal parties, really. What we call the conservatives, Senator Cruz and so on, they are also liberals, but they are the older liberals from the 18th century. And then you have the Roosevelt liberals, that is from the 20th century. The Roosevelt liberals, as we said, modified the liberalism socially by taking principle from the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years, in 1934, and thereby modified this liberalism by saying, okay, you should be responsible, and that is what liberalism means. As an individual, liberalism is an atomistic type of a theory. So everybody's on his own, everybody has to be strong, and you have to be responsible, and so on. You should take care of yourself, and you should do your own health care, and so on and so on, and the state should be small, and so on. And so that was kept by Roosevelt, by the New Dealers. But at the same time, what happens when you cannot do that? Well, then your family should help you. But if your family has not enough to send you to the university and so on, well, then the city or the county or the state or the whole federation. And what if the federation cannot help itself, like in New Orleans or whatever? Then we have to ask the community of American states or the UN or whatever. So that is the principle of subsidiarity. And that makes the difference between Obama on one side. He has that principle. And the other side, the Tea Party, has canceled it. The Tea Party has canceled it because they thought that capitalism would not have another crisis like 1929, 1939. And so they deregulated, and thereby, since Reagan, and thereby we had this catastrophe as 2008, which we are not out of yet even. So that is why these things have happened in recent days. So it has something to do with disciplining the labor force. There's one sentence by St. Paul, where St. Paul says, who does not work should not eat. And this is taken very seriously by that older form of liberalism. They say people have this tendency to be lazy, the original sin idea, and therefore one way to make them work is to connect healthcare to the job. And if they don't want to work, then they should die, and so on. So, and in the meantime, the world has moved on to some extent and has moved beyond this. And in Canada, and in England, and in Denmark, and in Norway, and in Germany, and everywhere. And so that has come to us now too. But the same forces which have prevented us from having this healthcare for so long are also now arming themselves to a last attack, and they lost. And we said already the last time now, after this loss, that we do not humiliate people who lost. Sarah Palin may be a strange phenomenon from Alaska, but to laugh about her is not really fair. Whatever has happened to her, that she has this type of a horizon which does not really fit into the real world, I feel that it would be so bad to laugh about her as it would be about a handicapped person or whatever. So we have to be very careful now. We have to learn not to humiliate the losers. These people will continue to lose because they are against the mainstream of the historical process in this country, in the Slavic world, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere. And so it is very hard for them to, the first Tea Party was very progressive, and this one is very reactionary now. And so if they go on to take that position, they will be disappointed again and again and again. So, but we have to, first of all, they are human beings like we are, and it is not ethical to humiliate other people. It's certainly not Christian and so on. It becomes very bad when they use Christianity for this position. To vote down, as we did 2 weeks ago, vote down for 4 million people the food stamps, or to deny people health care, has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus of Nazareth. And so this is our norm in our discourse. We could take other norms, we could take humanistic ones, modern ones, but we are concerned with the present Pope and the future of the Church. And there the norm is the first paradigm, it's the Gospels. And according to the Gospels, one cannot defend such action. It is not what the Rabbi Jesus has taught and what he died for. He was not a businessman like Mohammed. He was not a nobleman like the Gautama, the Buddha. He was not a middle-class man like the other Jewish prophets, but he was from the lowest class, and he defended this class. He spoke in their name. He challenged and provoked the rich and the ruling class continually, from the Sermon on the Mount to every parable which follows afterwards, in which he makes the Sermon on the Mount clear. And it came to the point where he then threw the bankers out of the temple, which broke the camel's back, and a few days later he was executed. So that is why he died, because of the challenge of the ruling class, and all those who followed him and did the same thing were martyrized for 300 years. And then the church made a deal with the state and became a state church since St. Augustine and so on, who is the founder of the Roman Catholic paradigm. So that is just a little bit of the background, but important for this, why we have this reading, is that we want to keep in mind what our criterion is when we say what the Pope should do, or what he has done, or what his predecessors have done, or how he should change in order to rescue the Church. Because you know that there are books out there which have the title, Can the Church Be Rescued? And so Hans Küng, for instance. So we are in a very deep crisis situation. And it's important then also, and we will do that, to remember that the Church was in other deep crisis situations, and it survived it. And this can give us some confidence that it will survive this crisis as well, but it is very serious. So now after this reading there, let's just follow here, so that when you're at home then you can look at some of these points there, and then you can remember it. So in our first discourse, we said here, we introduced ourselves to each other, and that is important, and we determined our topic. So our topic is Francis I and the future of the Church. And we talked about the predecessor, Benedict XVI, and I reminded us that I had in the newspapers here, there was a little controversy. The bishop said that he resigned because he was, because of old age, and that was of course true. But there had been many popes in the last hundreds of years who were old and they did not resign, like the predecessor, for instance. So therefore there must be another reason, and there were other reasons. And we summed it up, and we don't have to go into this. The Pope resigned, besides old age, because the paradigm with which he worked, we call that the patristic paradigm. That means the church fathers. So there were Greek church fathers, and there were Origenes, for instance, and then in the Orthodox Church. And then there were also Latin fathers like Augustine, and Professor Ratzinger was a specialist for this. When in the Council, the Second Vatican Council, the scholastic paradigm, Thomas Aquinas, broke down, the Council thought, and with the next election and so on, elections, that maybe Ratzinger would be a smart man, and with this very impressive patristic paradigm, because the church fathers were enlighteners. They were part of the Hellenistic Enlightenment. And so one could hope that this paradigm would help the church to deal with the new Enlightenment. So we have the bourgeois Enlightenment in this country, Rousseau and Voltaire and so on, and our constitution. This is not a Christian constitution. That is an Enlightenment constitution. And then there's the Marxist Enlightenment, which we have repressed here. And then there's the Freudian Enlightenment, which we have repressed half. And so this is the other side there. And so people thought that with this patristic paradigm, the Pope could deal with this antagonism, as we called it the last time, between the religious and the secular, the sacred and the profane. And it did not work. So he got in trouble, and many, many troubles. But one was that his predecessor had said already that maybe the monks of the Inquisition who sentenced Galileo Galilei, the 70-year-old man, that maybe the Inquisition, there was something wrong with it. And then Ratzinger suddenly said, no, there was nothing wrong with the Inquisition. It was all Galileo Galilei. And so people got so upset in the University of Rome that he was invited, so they threw him out. So, and there were many of these things, so that the Europeans called him our Taliban. And that didn't sound very good. So he was certainly not a fundamentalist and so on, but he looked like one. And it is very hard in this antagonism with all these culture wars and so on to say the right thing. And I'm quite sure that very often he was misunderstood. He went to the Diet in Germany, the Bundestag in Berlin, and he gave a speech about environmental problems, and it was a modern type of a speech. And but then he right away said some sentences which alienated people again. So it was not his intelligence, but it was a paradigm which was as obsolete as the scholastic paradigm was. So that leaves the church now with Francis I. It leaves the church without a viable paradigm. A paradigm means that you have a certain vocabulary in which you can speak, that you have a certain logic for argumentation and so on. And our seminarians, for a long time, they were all trained in Thomas Aquinas, and Thomas Aquinas was a very wonderful and great thinker who rescued the church from the Islamic attack in Paris. The church almost went under in Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus and so on. At that time, rescued the whole thing. So, and they learned him by heart and neo-scholasticism, but it became more and more untenable. So this is, it is as if a snake gets out of one skin and doesn't have a new one. That is the situation in which the church is, and it's a very dangerous situation. Or whatever little animal rids itself of its house, a little snail, and in order to build a new house, and this in-between thing, it becomes very open for predators who can eat it up in the middle. So particularly our most vulnerable point is the parousia delay. That means that we are waiting for 2,000 years for the Messiah, and he has not come. And the brothers, the Islamic brothers, wait already for how long is it? 1,400 years, and the Jews wait already for 4,000 years, a little bit less. So that parousia delay is the painful open flank of all three Abrahamic religions. And so that we don't have at the moment a model to think things through and translate the Christian message so that things can be understood better by people. Let me jump ahead a little bit to contemporation and take that up here. We want to talk about some contemporary issues, and we did already. But there's a wonderful sister was on television twice already now, on CNN usually. I think she is the head of the Catholic Social Services or something like that. And she took up the case of all those who suffered because of the shutdown, but before already because of the voting down of the food stamps and so on. And she made a beautiful point, and I'm quite sure that everybody who saw her liked her and loved her because of her humanity, of her humanness, which appeared there in the interview. But she's then used a vocabulary she talked about the common good. The common good is part of the Catholic solidarism, which is part of the scholastic model. So all the encyclical letters from 1891 to the most recent ones of Benedict, they are all written in the scholastic terminology, which already in the council was not adequate. But what is more important is that the people with whom she uses that beautiful word of the common good, that they cannot understand her, because that means they hear the sound, of course, and common good, but what it really means, it cannot move the heart of people, because it is a strange language. It comes out of a paradigm which has never been in the United States. It comes from the natural law position. That means that the Stoics had this natural law position. It goes back to Aristotle and Plato. And the church baptized it and took it over. And this natural law position by which we decide, for instance, things like masturbation or birth control, all that rests on that paradigm, because there's nothing in the New Testament about it or in the Old Testament. So that we had never had this natural law, this traditional natural law. The bourgeoisie, the third estate, which governs this country here, and made the revolution in England and in France and so on, they developed another natural law against Catholicism, where not the universal human nature, but the individual human nature of everybody, every human being, every individual, was the basis of the whole argument. So we hear that this is still somewhat present when we say the Equal Marriage Act, and that we say before the homosexuals or the lesbians are what they are according to their preference, they are human beings. And as human beings, we are all equal. Therefore, they also have, it's a syllogism, therefore they also have the right to marry each other and so on. So, and then all the Jewish people were emancipated by this thinking. We think, first of all, the Jewish person is, first of all, a human being. And then, secondly, he is also a Jew. Therefore, as a human being, he doesn't have to be in the ghetto anymore. He can come out. He can join all the other people and can have the professions which he wants to have and so on. Suddenly the Jewish people broke into the Western civilization and did great things in music, in philosophy, think of Einstein in quantum physics and so on. And then came the backlash, which you know, fascism. Fascist backlash, and they were burned in the concentration camps, so gassed. Cyclone B. So let's go back there too, and then we come back to the sister there. So that means if religious people enter the public sphere, this book just came out there, The World Religions in the Global Public Sphere, which I just published in India, and there's the question, you know, when the sister enters the public sphere, when she's in the convent, she can say one thing and people can understand her there. But when she enters the public sphere, she has to see who these people are now. The people who are there to whom she talks know only one norm, and that is the positive law which has been made in Congress and which has made in the state legislators, and nothing else. We have no metaphysics in this country. We have no traditional natural law in this country. We have no bourgeois natural law on which the Constitution is based. Not even that we have. So when you talk into that space, into that public space now, and you use a word which is connected with this whole natural law position, and it would be the same thing when you talk about birth control and so on. No modern person in this country or in Europe or so can understand a thing what you say. So that is something in the present crisis, in order to get out of it, is the question how we translate such a thing like the common good. The always more perfect union was a translation of it, an inversion of that once in terms of the fathers of the Constitution, that we want to look forward to an always more perfect union among ourselves. Says something similar to the common good or so. So nevertheless, this, I don't want to go too deep into the whole thing. But in order to see the abyss between the sister and the audience on television or whatever, goes far back. For Plato, once we interpreted the New Testament in Platonic terms, and there the idea of things was in heaven, and it was a very otherworldly. Augustine has that still. And then we changed over to Aristotle, where this idea is in the tree, it works in the tree. That's much more worldlier. And Thomas Aquinas rescued the church by learning from Averroes, a Muslim Aristotelian, to interpret the New Testament now in Aristotelian terms. But now, with the Reformation, we became de-Hellenized. That means the Hellenistic thing was pushed back, already in the Reformation and in the French Revolution, and also then in multiculturalism now. That means that we cannot understand that we now are what is called nominalists. That means things like the idea of things, human nature or whatever, is not in people, or the genus or species is not in the cat, dog, or whatever, but it's only in our head. It's a name in our head by which we sort and organize things. Now, when you are somebody standing in the Aristotelian tradition like the sister, she talks to nominalists over there. It takes a completely different meaning for them, and they cannot really grasp it. They are nice to her and say, this is a beautiful idea, sister, but nobody knows what she means, and therefore they cannot possibly translate this now into a practice, into parliamentary terms, or to form policies which you then submit to the body to discuss it and to make a law out of it or whatever. Okay, you can always break me up, and I'm glad to explain everything, but we want to go a little bit forward here. So he resigned because the last pope resigned, and this is important why he resigned, because that dictates what the next one has to do now, because if he simply repeats him, he will have the same disaster. So the patristic paradigm was not sufficient to approach, not to speak, to resolve the contradictions in the modern and postmodern world where we are now. Since 1917, we have left modernity behind and move into a postmodern age which we don't know the name of yet, which has a lot to do with the confusion and the value collisions in your children and your grandchildren and in ourselves. And not only in the modern world, but in the church as well. We'll see, you can say this is inside of the church and that is outside of the church or whatever. But in reality, this outside and inside is interconnected. So when you have a feminist movement outside, you can bet that this feminist movement will appear suddenly in our women's monasteries and so on, and among women as well. So whatever is going on outside will also go inside. Sooner or later, it will become a problem. So the argument of the church with basically child abuse is, well, out there in the real world, you had that Kinsey report and you had that Freudian enlightenment and so on. So what do you expect? Then they come into the seminaries and that's how they are, and that is why this happens and so on. I think that's much too simple there, obviously, but nevertheless, this is some type of an argumentation. So particularly the dichotomies between, and so we want to concentrate on one. There are about 55 of these contradictions in American civil society. None of them are solved. All of them are tremendously painful. And you can look at my website. I have signed them up, and I could bring up 50 more if you want to. So, since we are not as positivists and as nominalists, we are not willing to look at them, our scientists neither, because we think we cannot resolve them. Now, when you do not look at them, then you can really not resolve them. If we would look at them, then we could at least, discuss them, and maybe we could see if we can do something about it. So there is this religious and the secular, and it goes deeper and deeper. Since Galileo, it has gone deeper and deeper, and it doesn't stop. It goes deeper and deeper. So if it is not stem cell research, then it's homosexuality. If it's not homosexuality, then it's euthanasia, and so on and so on. Every day something comes up, and it goes deeper and deeper, and it goes systematically more and more to the secular side. That is why the church is in crisis and has to be rescued, because the secularization does not stop. Before 1880, people taught about divorce what the New Testament talks about the divorce. A man cannot, if a man divorces his wife, he makes her an adulteress. Whoever marries a divorced person lives in adultery, and so on and so on. All these tough things. Then the West moved away from all of this. In the 8th already, and so on, it started. The Protestants were more open and more relaxed about it, but Catholicism kept to the New Testament strictly and did not give up. So, but all the states then allowed divorce, and most recently in the most Catholic states like Ireland, Spain, and so on. The same thing now with homosexual unions and so on. We have 19 states here already. Long before Belgium is a Catholic country did it already, and Holland is a Protestant country, and so on and so on. So you see that the whole thing cannot be stopped. So the children who sit in my class, their grandmother, who was a Baptist, thought the same way like the Pope. Her mother said, well, divorce is bad, but sometimes you need it. Birth control is not right, but you need it. You cannot have more than 2.1 children, and so on. So the mother was back and forth, and so on. And the girl who sits there in front of me there, she cannot even remember what her grandmother thought. And if she could remember, she wouldn't understand a thing. So that is how fast we move from one generation to the other, away from it toward secularization, which is a problem which you don't have to go into. So there's also the gender antagonism, of course. Women have suffered tremendously under all the patriarchal religions, under Islam, under Judaism, under Christianity, we are still the patriarchal religion. Your children have the name of your husband, or the name of the father, not the brother of the mother, as it would be if we were matriarchal. So we are still patriarchal. My female colleagues on campus get less money for the same work which they do. Why? There is no reason whatsoever. And when we want to change that, they give them 10 cents more and so on. And they are simply not able to settle this, that this woman who does the same job, that she gets the same money which I get. So we're still patriarchal, and this patriarchal thing has made women suffer tremendously. If this is conscious or unconscious, women have developed a certain personality to deal with this pressure, so that we don't even know what a real woman would be like who would not have grown up in a patriarchal system. And the same thing is, of course, men. Since men repress the women, they are also not the real men who they would be if they would not continually be frightened that somebody else would take over and so on. So both genders are deformed by this patriarchal thing, which is 6,000 years old. So, but it has begun to crack all over the place. So when I taught at General Motors, the ethics that the workers described, when I was at home, my wife came home and she said, I want to be emancipated. And the worker said, who the hell emancipates me? And then they leave, and they go to California, and they get a more domesticated Asian woman instead of that. So, and then we have 2 or 3 million women, single parents, who come to us and then want to study in order to be able to feed their children and so on, because the husband has gone, because she got emancipated, and he was not emancipated. So this is the gender problem, and then there's the race thing, So, the Ku Klux Klan movement, and now this thing there, which is the Tea Party thing, they have some similarity with us, and there's a lot of racism involved too. And then we have this right and left, which you hear all the time, the radio stations and so on. They're all divided. There's the right and then there's the left, and it goes on all day long and so on. So, and then the whole equality and inequality thing, which was a horrendous tragedy. The Jews were killed, and these communists, the 27 million in Russia, were annihilated. Where I'm going now, next month I go to Yalta, and if you go east there's Stalingrad, which is now Volgograd and so on, where horrible, these rivers were full of blood. They were flowing, and it was not water anymore, it was all blood. So horrible this thing was. It was all about equality. Because on one side you had Jews and Christians who said we are all created equal, and therefore we should be equal in reality. And on the other side you had the fascists and the liberals as well. No, we are all different. There must be somebody up and there must be somebody down. There must be winners and losers, and so on. Otherwise the human species will disappear from this globe. And that was Hitler's ethics and so on. So therefore it was they all had to die over this equality. And when you look at this food stamp thing there are the welfare loafers down there, and they don't want to work, and therefore they need food stamps and so on. and why should they have health care? They are lazy, and so on and so on. So there you have the division. They are the ones who are on top, maybe 1%, but it's more than 1% if you take the upper bourgeoisie, and then there's the small bourgeoisie, the shopkeepers, and then there are 250 million workers down there, and so on. So there's inequality. And the liberals and the fascists do not want to have equality. What they say sometimes is equality of opportunity. And then they say, see, Obama, he came from below, he made it. But Clinton there, he came out of slums, he did it, and so on. So they take, the black fellow, African-American boy or whatever, and then they let him go to Harvard and so on. But nothing changed about these people who are down there. So, they think that must be that way. There must be people on top, the leaders, the job creators have to be there and so on. And then there are those for whom the jobs are created. And then you see the job creators don't work. If they would really function, then we would not have 7.5% unemployment. And it is not the task of the government to create jobs. It is the task of the businessmen to fulfill the needs which people have, housing and whatever, and also to give them jobs. And then they don't do this, therefore then the government has to intervene, and it will always intervene. So the only thing with the Tea Party, the simplest thing to keep the government small, would be that the businessman would function, and he doesn't function. And if he doesn't function, people will not tolerate this. But somebody else will come into that empty space, and that is the government. Then the government regulates, and then the government does. That's the nightmare of the Tea Party. It does in reality become bigger and bigger, and maybe that's not so good. But the real way to deal with this is to fulfill the task. The measure of the economy is the fulfillment of the needs of the people, which includes housing, eating, drinking, and clothing, and education and health care and so on. So they had time enough there. We are as late as anybody can do it. They had all these decades and decades to do it, and they didn't do it. So now they want to have another year and so on. How long are people supposed to wait? The first Roosevelt said it already. The second Roosevelt said it. The Germans have it since 1870 and so on. How long? So people will not wait, and that is why they're on the wrong side of history. They have one chance, and that is that capitalism would function. But capitalism does not function. Wherever you have food stamps, it doesn't function, because obviously the market does not reach these people. Wherever you have 40 million people in the slums, it does not function. Otherwise it would have gotten them out. Since 200 years, the civil society became richer and richer, but they were not able to get rid of the slums in Baltimore, in Chicago, in Detroit, and so on, or in Kalamazoo, or in Flint, or whatever. So if it doesn't function, then the government will be indeed getting bigger and bigger, and that is problematic. That's the truth of the Tea Party, you know. But they produce this whole situation there. Well, not really there. They are paid by the Koch brothers, so they are really paid by the capitalists. They are not capitalists. They're poor little creatures, the Tea Party. They are paid by somebody else and used as a tool, as an instrument to make all that noise and to bring the government down. And they will not stop. They will continue. Small minority, shouting and screaming all the time and well paid. So, but they will not come through. They will create pain and so on. But the masses of the people around the globe will not tolerate a dysfunctional type of an economic system. So, I mean, how shameful is it that the most capitalistic country has to take $1 trillion from the Chinese, which is a communistic country, and then we are taught by them that we should read not only the first volume of Adam Smith, namely The Wealth of Nations, but also the second one, namely How to Curb Greed. I mean, this is shameful. So, and this will accumulate all the time, and it will move forward, not because of Obama or whatever. It will move forward because of the masses of the people which push in a certain direction and will not tolerate this. So what is the only task of the Wall Street is to provide capital to industry so that they can build cars or can do research and so on. But what do? They give bonuses to themselves and increase their income in spite of the fact that they have been bailed out by the people's tax money. All these things will not quiet down, and they cannot be repressed. that is why the Tea Party will continually do, so whatever follows afterwards. We had, 150 years or whatever of the Ku Klux Klan, which had similar ideas, and they lost in the end too. But even today, they cannot accept that the Civil War was lost, and still murmur on all over the place. So, these are some of these contradictions here, or between the individual and the community, or man or nature in terms of the catastrophe and climate and so on, or order and progress. And so, therefore, also the universe. Anybody, but Jesus did judge them all the time. The Pharisee, you empty graves, and so on and so on. So from the morning to the night he judged. So we have to see what that means if their contradiction appears and so on. But the Pope, when he says, who am I to judge? That may be a Jesuitism. He's a Jesuit. He's not a Franciscan. The Jesuits are is an order, modern order, which was very special. They were the response to Puritanism. The Puritanists up there in the United States and so on, and the Calvinists. So they were the inner representation of the external heretical position of Puritanism, appeared inside of the church in terms of the Jesuits. They had no walls anymore. They had no monastery anymore. They are single, individual bourgeois operators. The Ignatius himself was an officer in Spain, so from the military, and he brought a lot of his military stuff and organized his order that way. They have always been the power behind the throne. They were the best defenders of the papacy, but they never put anybody into the papacy. So how deep the crisis is, you can see that the Jesuits themselves now have to take the papacy, so shaky the whole thing is. It's the same with us. Our ruling class never goes into the politics. They are the bankers, and they are the industrialists, and there they have all the power, of which the politics is only a funny shadow. But if the thing becomes shaky, as it was several years ago, then a Rockefeller will come in there. A Rockefeller was too bad to do banking or industry and so on, then they put him, make him the head of the university, or they put him into politics and so on. So the same way now, so in a crisis, the ruling class itself may go into politics in order to establish order. So in the church there's the same thing. The crisis which came about through Benedict could only be settled by not staying behind the throne anymore, and writing the encyclical letters. All the encyclical letters have been written by Jesuits, not by the popes. So, but now they don't write encyclicals anymore. He goes into front now and takes over the regime himself. That shows already how dangerous things are. Okay, so these are just two examples there, though that we have also here, we have to read things in the clear text. A Jesuit is a very smart man. He has two studies. He studies 6 or 7 years in theology, and then he studies something else for another 6 years, medicine, economics, and so on. We see the movie today, the 6 Jesuits who were murdered in San Salvador, in the university there, were all economists, so who know exactly what is pressed out of the coffee workers, what the coffee workers get and what you have to pay for the coffee, and what the middleman earns, and the whole fraud behind the whole thing, and then the fascists there just killed them with the housekeeper and the 16-year-old daughter of the housekeeper, butchered them and so on. So that is what the Jesuits did. That's something very astonishing, the order itself, very intelligent people, but also a little bit tricky sometimes. So we have to see and have to get the clear text when he says something. It is evasive. So will he really change the norm of the book Leviticus and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and St. Paul, that homosexuality comes from atheism and the whole natural law tradition? Will he undo that when he says, who am I to judge? Well, so it may very well be a Jesuitism. We have to see what comes from that. He may say, which he did also, it came through the press, that we are obsessed we are obsessed by abortion, for instance, and we should give up this obsession. That is a very good thing, but will he give up the norm against abortion? There's no indication whatsoever, and that will be, of course, the real problem finally. So, but we have the cardinal, informal cardinal of Chicago, and many others have revealed this horrible contradiction that the same politician who is against abortion and is pro-life and so on has nothing against paying for a war like in Iraq, where 1 billion people were killed and where 10,000 of them were women who had babies inside of themselves and were incinerated with them. No problem whatsoever. And they have no problem with the death penalty. As a matter of fact, the state of Illinois has now canceled the death penalty because the last governor, when he left there, did this. And he was a student of this cardinal. And the cardinal died from cancer, and they had even child abuse charges in the end, which were lies, and they were pushed down, thanks be to God. But then he died in despair because all the plans which he had came to nothing. But then his fight against the death penalty, at least, was fruitful, and the governor, before he left, canceled the death penalty and so on. So, but the same issue which the cardinal in Chicago had, this unbelievable contradiction that on the right people are talking or been obsessed by this abortion thing, and have nothing against 10,000 of women being killed as we bomb them and destroy the whole infrastructure of our country. So and that should be changed, and the Pope will probably. So we don't know where he will go. We have to be very careful. But what he said was the obsession has to go. The obsession goes does not mean that the norm against abortion will be cancelled, but that there are more important things maybe to do this. So it is horrible enough that we have 1.5 million abortions a year. That is a necrophilus, a death-friendly type of a society. But to regret this deeply and so on, and then on the other side do the killing oneself, that cannot go on neither. So, but we'll see how these tricky type of situations, how they will be resolved and how the Pope is to be understood. Okay, so we have another point here. So there are some others, we don't have to go into that there, but there we have some Catholics there who have done great damage. And the question is, what with our education, our Catholic education, how can that produce a character like this Ted Cruz or this Paul Ryan and so on? How can this happen? Dustin has written a book about Ayn Rand. So Ayn Rand is this refugee from Russia who came here, and she had this doctrine of egoism is good, selfishness is good, and all this and so on. And Dustin has written a beautiful book against it, and so he knows much more about this. But this Paul Ryan there, he followed this woman and so on, and her novels. He went to Georgetown, and Georgetown is a famous Jesuit university. All our diplomats are educated in Georgetown. And and they told him, he said, Paul Ryan, what you preach there, your fiscal program and so on, has nothing to do with Christianity, nothing to do with Catholicism. It's the exact opposite. And then he goes out there and goes on as if nothing had happened, and there are millions of Catholics who follow this guy. So Senator Cruz comes from Cuba originally. Grandfather came from Cuba. So he's a refugee from the Batista. Batista was one of the super gangsters whom we had. We have these gangsters everywhere. So his own people threw him out. And the revolution was not even a communistic one first. It became a communistic one when we put an embargo on the little country, and then they found friends in Russia. So and then he suddenly was in this Russian and Chinese camp, and which was not there. The Baptists fought with Castro against the gangster Baptista and so on, and his whole group of businessmen there. So we knew that he was a gangster. Nobody in this country defended any of his ethics or whatever. He was awful, but it was our gangster. And so it's our gangster, and it's a good gangster. So, well, but his people threw him out. So And now this is where he comes from. And he was also in Canada first, I think. Maybe he was a Canadian citizen first, but he cannot be a Canadian citizen now. A double citizenship, probably, something like that. So, but you saw him, I mean, he is one thing where we, again, should not humiliate or whatever. But on the other hand, we have to see, when things go horribly wrong, as they did there. A minority of maybe 18% or so of the Republican Party, a great party. It's Lincoln's party. It's a party of the Reconstruction laws and so on, and the fight also then against the Ku Klux Klan. Very effective, and so the Republican Party has a great history and so on. And one just doesn't know what has happened to them now. They are demolished. And because a small minority in the last election broke through, and this small put the leadership, conservative leadership, so the difference between conservative and reactionary, right? The Tea Party is reactionary. The center of the Republican Party is conservative. So Eisenhower was conservative. A conservative is somebody who knows you cannot conserve things without making innovations. You cannot preserve the old if you don't make some things new. A reactionary wants to preserve without changing anything, particularly not the healthcare and so on. So. But it is this group which has been which took that over, and so that there are Catholics involved there. That is very painful for the Catholic community, and then that will lead also to what the Pope will do and who will follow him. Or the Wall Street has already said that if the Pope will remember the poor, that's nice, and charity and so on. But if he wants to change anything, then he will lose. He will lose, he said. Well, so that is the thing in the sand, was it is a line in the sand, has already been drawn. So, okay, so then now about equality. But do you have anything which you would like to ask and break in? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, contemporary issue measured by the Gospels.
Right.
What would we look at? The Good Samaritan,
right.
the rich man who died in hotel. Right. Those are two examples of individual responses. Right. And your suggestion that Jesus held out hope for individuals to escape Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, that's the first time I heard that. I thought, wow, that opens up a whole new window of opportunity. Maybe it's about we individually accept responsibility to act out the Gospels.
Right.
And as individuals, the groups we form would have that instilled within us if we act it out.
Yeah.
But granted, you don't have a whole society based on gospel teaching, acting that out. You've got this you're outside of the Gospels for the most part because it's a small containment. But I think there is real hope. I mean, when I listened to you until now, I thought I could walk away with doom and gloom in my heart, thinking there is no answer.
Yeah, right.
But I have a lot of hope.
Yeah.
Individually, I feel like I've succeeded. I mean, I started from nothing and I moved up to where I am, which may not be very high in the eyes of many, but the bottom line is I feel really good about it. Yeah. And I'm wondering if people individually need that opportunity to feel really good about who they are, to be respected for what they contribute based on what they're able to give. Yeah. And as a society, we have groups that dictate. I think for my own children, they watch TV. They have a measure of what's really cool and really hot, and that's what they're striving for. Right. Instead of living it out within the family or within a peer group, they have this pseudo life that they base their actions on. Right. And I don't know. I think going back to Sodom and Gomorrah, Jesus suggesting the individual can still have hope. I'm thinking maybe that's where it's at. We have to have our own relationship with God and use that as a foundation for acting out, living the gospel.
Yeah, right. So what would be your point be now? You said we are living in a secular society, right? And most people are not Christians anymore or whatever. Others maybe still have the name, but they don't live according to it. And so it may very well be that this will be the future situation, that a small minority of people are still motivated by the Gospels and translate this in, like the sister who appears, in the public sphere and talks about the common good and so on, and that the state has to be neutral toward religion. The state cannot found a new religion. It cannot prefer one over the other. And so we can use that space, in order to represent. It may be that we appear completely like everybody else who is modern, right, and secular. So I think maybe Obama is something. Obama, as you know, he converted to Christianity in Chicago, with the Reverend Wright. So he grew up without any religion, but he then converted. And when he talks about tax reform or so, he does apply it, because tax reform, he wants to help the less fortunate, as we say, and that is a good Christian motif. So that is how it may be in the future, right? But Jesus also warned, about the wolves in sheep clothing. So there are people in the value meeting there in New York recently who use Christianity as a cover-up for the very opposite.
True.
So let's take the Bush thing there. He is born again. If he is born again, then we assume that he is a Christian now, and then we assume that he will take the Sermon on the Mount seriously and the Decalogue. And then when he suddenly, executes 151 people in his prison, and when there is a born-again woman there who asks him for pardon, and he laughs about her on Sunday, and Monday he executes her, then we know that, by their fruits you will know them. Why did the Christians not apply that concept of Jesus, by their fruits you will know them? They saw that he was a killer from the start, and that if he would get more power, he would kill more. And so he did, a whole million of them. So why can't... See, the New Testament is not so blind or so archaic or so backward or whatever. It's 2,000 years, and we are not in a slaveholder society anymore. We are not in a feudal society. We are in a capitalistic society. Jesus lived on a much lower level of exchange processes, commodity exchange, than we do, but there are fundamental issues which are as true today as they were at that time. You can criticize, of course, and can say we cannot pray any longer, "Our Father, give us our daily bread," because at that time, when it didn't rain, there was no bread. Now we have all the bread factories, the capitalists own them, we have labor unions and so on. The mediation is so unbelievable that it doesn't make any sense anymore to pray that prayer. That's what modern people would say. Or they would say, love your neighbor or whatever. In a capitalist society which is atomized like this, there is no neighbor. My neighbors, I'm 50 years in the same area, I know almost nobody, and nobody knows me. If you're on a skyscraper, one dies on top of it, you don't even know that he is dead or is missing. So therefore, it's still applicable. So, secular people, have criticized Christianity at least since 200 or 300 years. There is not one little word in the New Testament which higher criticism has not dug into and seen how meaningful it is. So when a modern man hears that Jesus says, look, the birds, they do not work, but the Heavenly Father feeds them. And then Paul says, who does not work should not eat. They say, what are they asking us to accept now? What a mixed up type of a message is this? See? So therefore, all this has to be settled. Now, about that you feel good, there's nothing wrong with feeling good. I think it's beautiful. Everybody should feel good. So we have to distance ourselves a little bit from when we discuss now the Church and the Pope and so on. And I don't know if you wanted to say that the message was only for individuals or so, that it was not for
well, could I interject a thought?
Yeah.
A lot, the neighborhood thing. I used to not know anybody in my neighborhood, and my son went to Afghanistan, and during that time I just thought, Lord, how am I going to make it through the year? And I ended up picking up pine cones on the boulevard. which erupted into a whole unique series of events that got me involved in the neighborhood, where now we're reclaiming a park, and I'm working with Buddhists and Baha'is and all people from so many different religions. I mean, I'm the only Catholic within that group.
Right.
But what we focus on is the commonality and the goal.
Right.
I mean, we work well with each other. Religion doesn't really have a say in our interactions, other than we live out of the core of our being. The Buddhist, I mean, I go to the home, I see the statue of Buddha, I see the prayer flags, and that's his expression of a God connection.
Right, and you do the right thing. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. So therefore, we could say, maybe the Our Father is not so obsolete as modern people think, right?
Because I could say the Our Father in that Buddhist home and not be ostracized.
Exactly.
I would do it without, I guess I would ask for permission, but I felt the need to say it orally within group, but I don't do it without invitation.
Yeah. And also even in a Jewish group you could do the Our Father, right? There's nothing about the Incarnation, nothing about the Trinity, so Jewish brothers and sisters would not have any problem with it. So it's the secular people, who would say that belongs to a earlier historical context, and now the context has changed, therefore the text is not valid.
Well, and even when Cantor Larry was alive, I ended up at the synagogue, and oh my goodness, I was privileged to hold the Torah, and I just thought, holy smokes, it was just like a life-changing experience in my world, but it's like the love of God, if you will, permeated the interactions, as opposed to the antagonisms, or, I guess I don't like that word, but I understand the theory behind it. I guess I would push for, what do we have that's common and useful?
Exactly, because this issue is not to identify the antagonisms, but to identify them in order to resolve them, right? And a certain thing you're doing a good job, and by building bridges between other religions and also between these religions and the secular world out there,
but
right?
It's individual and it's project-oriented.
Yeah. Of course, without individuals, nothing happens. But let me give you an example. The fourth commandment of the Sermon on the Mount, the old people said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and so on. And Jesus says, hold up the other cheek. When the Roman soldier asked you to march 1 mile, march 2 miles with him, then the Muslims, the imams would say, that is a very good principle, it's beautiful, but you can only use it as an individual, so you cannot use it in politics. If you use it in internal politics or international politics, it will be seen as a weakness. You had that recently when Obama, threatened to bomb Syria, and then he didn't. Then O'Reilly said, he appears weak. He's weak. O'Reilly thinks he's a Catholic, Irish Catholic. There you have this strange type of a thing, So but that is what the Muslims would say. They would say it's a good principle, but only from individual to individual. But if you want to go into politics on the public space or in international relations, then it's not good, because people will think that you are weak. And then that makes it even more dangerous, the whole thing. And so the rabbi would say the same things. He would say, that's our teaching, we taught that before. And so, but you can only use it in personal relationships. So there you can forgive and so on. But if you do it between states or between parties inside of the state, then you will appear weak, and then that will create more problems, than the other thing. If you retaliate. If you retaliate, then you are strong, So bomb them, when the Hamas people, send some rockets into Palestine, then just bomb them, and show them superpower, and that will impress them. So there is a discrepancy, and from a liberal point of view, they have always interpreted the New Testament in individualistic terms. But is it really meant that way? Did Jesus really teach and say the Sermon on the Mount, that's just for you personally, but not for the state or not for society or whatever? So that is the question which we would have to answer. So then, the New Testament would just be a private thing, and that is, of course, that is the whole bourgeois constitution and so on. They took religion out of the state and make it a private affair in civil society. And the Muslims are fighting against that because they are holistic. they think, it's not only my person in my heart or whatever, but it also is my family, it's also society. They have the usury laws, which Catholics had too, and which we reduced to almost nothing. And so they continue the usual law and so on. So that's what the struggle is about, because we want to impose on them the separation of the Ummah and the state, and they say, the Islam includes everything. That's what the Islamic Brotherhood does. And that's what Catholicism does too. That's why we have the natural law position, We have a theory of the state, we have a theory of society, we have a theory of culture, and so on. Because Christianity is not only a private affair for the heart, but it has something to do with the polity and with the society and so on. So, by the way, when he converted Obama and had this for Reverend White, he had to distance himself from him, because Reverend White applied those things of the Torah and the New Testament to our nation. And he said, you killed you murdered the whole race, You enslaved the whole race. You enslaved your own race to a large extent, and that was very uncomfortable. And then the right, used that against Obama, and so Obama had to distance himself from it out of political reason. I don't think he distanced himself otherwise. So, okay, so I mean, this is, first of all, what you're doing is beautiful. You can be happy with yourself and with your neighborhood and all the work. I think that's great. And see, it goes already. I mean, if you do something about a park, that goes already beyond the boundary of the family.
And it's spiraling into bigger and bigger because
right,
now we're a
exactly,
community association
right, exactly,
and looking at traffic flow and crime.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
But it began
well,
individually.
You do it all.
With Pine Cones on Boulevard. Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think we all try to do our part. But
exactly.
I think there are solutions. I think we
right.
just have to focus on
right.
the best of
yeah.
the art.
Okay.
The concept of, I guess for me, the whole idea of secularism, and I could be wrong on this, but it seems to me that was one of the ingenious concepts of America, in the sense that before that time, and it seems to me anyway, that a lot of the religions have come together as a reaction. It's like without secularism, they would have continued to fight, and they've only united against that.
Exactly, yeah.
And so the idea when we started this country was, how can we create a culture where people can each have their own
right.
and not hurt the other? Because historically that has been really what that was about.
Right.
And so in my mind, I've always thought that was a good thing.
Yeah.
I don't, and it seems to me that secularism has grown and grown only because the churches have in many ways lost their meaning.
Yeah.
And I know with my own son, I have a son who's in college, and I mean, we raised him to be Catholic, but he really, in a conversation with us, turned to us and said, I don't believe this because I don't think you do. And that was tough.
That's exactly,
because,
that's very tough, yeah.
And there are many things that, that you've identified, the role of women historically throughout the ages, the racism. I mean, I'm kind of appalled by even early slave. I mean, like, I think the Catholic Church, who I think responded pretty honorably and through that, in the sense of try to educate African American people and form schools and.
But the Ku Klux Klan, attacked Catholics, right? It was anti-Catholic,
right.
anti-Jewish,
right.
Anti-black, right.
So anyway, I'm just.
No, you're absolutely right. So when we discuss, where the Pope should go or where we should go, and then we look, at this secularity now. Of course, the modern state was necessary. It would never have come into existence without the Reformation, by the way. So that may be a hard thing now, What do we think about Luther and our Protestant brothers? They are all still under the ban, they're all still heretics. The Episcopalian Church here, when they celebrate the Mass, is a Messa Sicca, it's a dry Mass. It has not been accepted, the ordination is not accepted. So there are all these problems involved. But as far as the state is concerned, the bourgeoisie, the third estate, shopkeepers and businessmen and so on, they removed the first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, the nobility, and created these constitutions. Our constitution comes from this long tradition of the French encyclopedists, and it is a work of at least a century. They didn't just make it up in Philadelphia. So, and it's a masterpiece. We need now a constitutional assembly because the civil society has become so big and the state has become so unevolved. So something would have to be done. But if we do it now, we have the Tea Party and so on. Heaven knows what would come out. But definitely, there was no other way. There was no other way. The bourgeoisie had to develop a state which was not any longer legitimated by Catholicism or by Lutheranism or whatever, because there was the civil war between Protestants and Catholics from 1618 to 1638, where they butchered each other and they ruined the whole European continent. And if you would have based the state on that, you would have a civil war situation, like you have it now in Egypt or whatever, and in Syria. So it was the only way to go. But, will the papacy accept this, you see? The papacy thinks still that the Reformation should never have happened. What are we doing with this, The papacy is still critical against the bourgeois revolution, which our country comes from. We didn't have a revolution here because George was already a constitutional monarch. It had already happened. You cannot make a revolution against a constitutional monarch. It was a struggle between the Boston bourgeoisie, the Tea Party, the Boston bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie in London, and they were not equal. And therefore we did not want to pay taxes because we were not in the parliament there. And modern colonies were that way. So that is what we protest against. What was really a revolution was the Civil War, where the northern ruling class annihilated completely the southern one. And thereby the slaves were set free, but not right away. There's Ku Klux Klan and so on comes in there. But they were only slowly, over 50, 60 years, slowly turned from slaves into wage laborers, particularly by Henry Ford here, who used them as strikebreakers against the white workers in Detroit.
And Carnegie. But also, the American Revolution was a revolution by the bourgeoisie. I mean, it wasn't, they were not really working then. Jefferson, all of them.
That's right, exactly.
They were not.
And that brings us to a completely different thing now, where the Pope has to take a position now, because these constitutions were made for the bourgeoisie. They did not only leave out the slaves, which were standing outside in Philadelphia, but they also left out the whole 250 million today. So that is why we have no Labour Party. We have no Social Democratic. There's no other country which doesn't have that, see, which plays into the present crisis now. Because what you have is the democratic left, the Roosevelt people, who want to have that Obamacare and so on. And they do what usually social democrats do, or Labour people do in Europe, But then they say on the right, you become European, you imitate the Europeans, you become socialist, Obama, etc. and so on. So you have this whole struggle now. And so what are we doing about it? What will the Pope do? That's our main question here. What will the Pope do about this? When he says, I cook my own meals and I drive on the bus. So he said that, we all drive on the bus, we all cook our own meals. So, I mean, what about it? So there is already a false image, namely some kind of a papal, what should I say, myth, papal myth somehow. I know when I grew up during the Nazi time, they always said, the Catholic youth movement always said, and the Pope, the lights are always on in the Vatican. He works day and night, and he loves the German people, and he works for the German people, and so on. Well, maybe he left the light on. Maybe he couldn't sleep well without the light on. But this is part of a myth now, you see. So, he cooks himself. Well, he probably should, and he doesn't use gasoline anymore. He charges the bus. That's very good, too. So, but it is just a symbolism now. We have to see, what he will really do about this class struggle, The church was always, in the Middle Ages and modernity, on the side of the ruling class. And we want to look at a few pictures there of the movie to see that with Romeo, Because Romeo was also on the side of the fascist ruling class, the coffee producers and so on. And then suddenly he went to the other side slowly with the liberation theologians and the Christian basic communities, of which 70,000 were killed by the fascists there before the UN interfered, and we paid for it. We paid $1 million a day in order to keep the fascists going. So, and we go now, we have a parish there, and we bring people over here, so we are doing good things. But when Father Ken goes there, he says, I couldn't have done what Romero did, and what all these liberation priests who all died and were all murdered and so on. That's true. None of us, I think I'm not martyr material, and it's an unbelievable thing what these brothers and sisters went through there and so on. So, but what will the position be? He comes from there. That's why we want to show the movie. Will he be a Romero, or will he make a deal? He did make a deal with the fascist junta in Argentina, and so that is not a good sign, and we have to be honest about this too. He also was allied with, not with Opus Dei, which the last Pope was connected with. That is a very dangerous connection. But there is another movement close to Opus Dei in Milano, and he has great sympathies for that. So that has to be watched. But what is underneath that are not these organizations. Opus Dei is a businessman organization, Catholic businessman organization, and so we can, if you want to, we can discuss that. But the question is, how will he deal with the class thing? Catholicism tried to have a middle course. Catholicism is called solidarism. That is our model, right? We are solidarists, and they didn't want to have liberalism on one side, and they didn't want to have socialism on the other side. So we have a position which is between socialism and liberalism and so on. But then we had concordance with the fascists. The Hitler Concordat is now still valid in Germany. So what will he do about this? But from Augustine to Thomas Aquinas to the Jesuits of the 60s of last century, it was all, our God is a God of the owners and not a God of the workers, and so on. Then came Metz, whom I brought here, and the Gutierrez and so on, and the liberation theologians. They said, Christianity, the Gospels tell us we have to be on the side of the working class and not the rich and the ruling class and so on. So that was a shift now. What will he do about it? His predecessor, worked together with the CIA everywhere, and he took those people, those theologians, to Rome. There's a very medieval, feudal type of a court system. You cannot even bring your own lawyer with you. And there were cardinals. 3 cardinals came with one of these theologians to Rome, and they had to stay outside of the courtroom, And he had to go in alone, and Ratzinger was presiding there. He was the great inquisitor. And so this is 20 years of horrible behavior of the church toward all these people, So we have to see what he will do about this. He said he went to the fascist junta, and he talked to them, and they did not listen to him. That's very understandable, right? So he, 2 priests have charged him that he left them in the ditch. One has died in the meantime. The other one, I told you, he celebrated a mass with him, and they had a reconciliation. But obviously something has happened there. But the priest forgave him for this. Now, I grew up under fascism, and I know how unbelievable strong that is. The Republican Party, now being captured there by the small right wing there you know how hard that can be. Wehner is not a bad man, but that he fell victim to this small minority, and shows how powerful that is when this fanaticism takes over. So when you have a fascist group, fascist regime, nobody can tell to them, you should have done this or this, because it's so unbelievably difficult, when you are under fascist rule and so on. So therefore, we don't want to count that, we don't want to say that this will, be what he will do for the rest of his papacy or whatever. But he will see if, besides driving in a bus and besides cooking for himself, if he will shift from this side to legitimate the ruling class, as they legitimate the feudal lords and the slaveholders and the capitalists so far, and if they will identify with us, like the sister did. Sister said, what do these people do now without the food stamps and so on, right? So if he takes this side, sometimes Catholics try to balance both sides. So when I studied in Baltimore, the sisters had a hospital, and on one side they were the rich, and there they could pay. And then they had another building for the poor. and then they sneaked over the food which was left over and took it to the other building. So whatever came from the rich, they transferred it over, and so the poor were taken care of, you know. I had a Catholic doctor in Baltimore, and he treated my whole family for nothing. And then he gave me the Hippocratic oath, which was hanging there, and said, take it home. We have betrayed it all. He was ashamed of it, and so on. So see, now Obamacare comes. Suddenly the doctors will get $5,000 for an operation and not $25,000. That is also what the whole struggle is about. These people exploited, you know, for decades and decades, our sick people. They came from all over the place. 4 of my friends came from Germany because in Baltimore they could get rich. Nowhere you could exploit sick people as you could do it here. That will end now, and that will be hard, you know. And so the question is where in this type of class struggle, where the Pope will stand. That will be very decisive if we can handle the crisis or not. Of course we should be optimistic, you are right. You know, we should be hopeful and so on. But it must be an informed type of a hope, right? Not only a feeling, but rooted in reality in terms of what will Rome do, or what will the Protestants do, and what will real people do now besides us. And it's not only a private thing as well. So let's take just a few pictures there of Romero, because he was a conservative man, but slowly, because of the death of his priests and all these Christian groups, basic Christian communities, he changed slowly. He never became a liberation theologian before he was assassinated in Providence Hospital in San Salvador.